Dr. Richard Curtis, and I'm a member of the steering committee of 9/11 Truth Seattle. I first met our featured speaker as a student at the School of Religion at Claremont Graduate University. When I arrived in Claremont, Dr. David Ray Griffin was world famous as a theologian and an authority on the school of theology called Process. I found him to be engaging and compelling, a deeply thoughtful figure and rigorous in his academic work. As a professor at the Claremont School of Theology and at Claremont Graduate University for 30 years, Dr. Griffin was also a co-director of the Center for Process Studies, and somehow found the time to publish dozens and dozens of articles and to write or edit 25 books. He's retired from teaching now, and the book that he will discuss this evening is his 32nd. Around the time I finished my coursework and moved up here, something horrible happened in the world that changed many lives, including eventually his. Over time and through a series of chance encounters with difficult information, he resolved to look into the allegations that were being made that what happened that day was not what we were told. During his last year before retiring, these investigations led him to write his first book on the subject, The New Pearl Harbor. And his writing that book led me to take seriously these questions. I knew Dr. Griffin to be the sort of person who is careful with details and not given to wild speculation. That book changed my life, and most of you here probably have some sort of story to tell about what brought you to ask those difficult questions, and even more so to face the disturbing answers that follow. In the last couple of years, a few official and unofficial bodies have attempted to argue that Dr. Griffin and what has come to be called the 9/11 Truth Movement are mistaken. And they've attempted to explain how what we were told is possible, in spite of the obvious impossibilities identified by various researchers over the years. Tonight, Dr. Griffin will reply to those critics of the truth movement. And now, it's my pleasure to present to you Dr. David Ray Griffin, author of the new book, Debunking 9/11 Debunking, an answer to popular mechanics and other defenders of the official conspiracy theory.
Good evening. I'm glad to be speaking here in Washington, the state in which I was born a few years ago. I am, in fact, old enough to remember a popular song called Let's Get Physical. Shortly after that song came out, it was very popular. A friend of mine, knowing my philosophical proclivities, gave me a button to wear to parties saying, "Let's get metaphysical." Now that I've been involved in the 9/11 Truth Movement for several years, I have a new plea. Let's get empirical. And that's the title of my lecture tonight, 9/11, Let's Get Empirical. The reason I make this plea is explained in the first page of my new book, Debunking 9/11 Debunking. I begin by saying the evidence that 9/11 was an inside job is overwhelming. Most people who examine this evidence with an open mind find it convincing. The only problem is to get people, especially journalists, to examine this evidence. Many of them believe that they need not do this because they already know that the claim that it was an inside job is false. As a result, many journalists, whether writing for the New York Times or the Guardian or the Progressive or the Nation, have pontificated about 9/11 while revealing that they know virtually nothing about the relevant facts. The question about what happened on 9/11 can be answered responsibly, however, only on the basis of a knowledge of these facts. And yet many journalists, like many other people, have used various means to avoid getting empirical about 9/11. One way to avoid getting empirical relies on an ambiguity in the term conspiracy theory. There are two main theories about what happened on 9/11. According to the government's theories, the attacks were planned by members of al-Qaeda under the inspiration of Osama bin Laden. According to the alternative theory, the attacks were orchestrated or at least assisted by forces within our own government. Many people, including many journalists, assume that the 9/11 Truth Movement's theory can be dismissed a priori because it is a conspiracy theory. But a conspiracy, says my dictionary, is an agreement to perform together an illegal, treacherous, or evil act. To hold a conspiracy theory about some event is, therefore, simply to believe that that event arose out of such an agreement. This is, we can say, the generic meaning of conspiracy theory. Given this generic meaning of the term, we are conspiracy theorists if we believe individuals have conspired to rob banks, that oil companies have conspired with scientists for hire to conceal the reality of human-caused global warming, or if we believe that American presidents have conspired with members of their administration to fabricate pretexts for going to war. In other words, once we get empirical about the term conspiracy theory, we realize we're all conspiracy theorists. Announcing that one rejects conspiracy theories has become almost a reflex action. But we would be more honest if we, with Michael Moore, would say, now, I'm not into conspiracy theories, except for those that are true. In spite of the obviousness of this point, many journalists follow propagandists in using the term conspiracy theory as an accusation. We can call this the propagandistic meaning of the term. Those who use the term in this propagandistic way ignore its generic meaning. They thereby equate theories as such, conspiracy theories as such, with a particular type of conspiracy theory, that is, the ones that are irrational, unscientific, kooky. Now, there are certainly many conspiracy theories of that nature. But our newspapers and TV news programs reveal some new conspiracy almost every day as a fact. So it is dishonest. It is pure propaganda to imply that all conspiracy theories are unworthy of belief. Those who use the term in this propagandistic way against the 9/11 Truth Movement never point out that the government's theory, which they endorse, is also a conspiracy theory. That the only difference between the two theories is the identity of the conspirators. For example, Jim Dwyer of the New York Times wrote a story entitled, "Two U.S. Reports Seek to Counter Conspiracy Theories About 9/11. A more accurate title would have been, "Two U.S. Reports Say Government's Conspiracy Theory is Better Than Alternative Conspiracy Theory." In an essay entitled, "Enough of 9/11 Conspiracy Theories Already," Matthew Rothschild of The Progressive said, "Here's what the conspiracists believe. 9/11 was an inside job. Members of the Bush administration ordered it, not Osama bin Laden. Arab hijackers may not have done the deed. The Twin Towers fell not because of the impact of the airplanes and the ensuing fires, but because of explosives. I'm amazed at how many people give credence to these theories." He did not have a paragraph saying, "Here's what the government's conspiracists believe. 19 hijackers with knives and box cutters defeated the most sophisticated defense system in history. Hani Hanjour, who could barely fly a Piper Cub, flew an astounding trajectory to crash Flight 77 into the Pentagon, the most well-protected building on the planet. Other hijacker pilots by flying planes into 2 buildings of the World Trade Center, caused 3 of them to collapse at virtually free fall speed, straight down. I'm amazed at how many people give credence to these theories. It did not occur to Rothschild to say this because he uses conspiracy theory as a term of abuse for conspiracy theories that he does not believe. A senior editor for In These Times, writing about his experience in 2005 of seeing my C-SPAN lecture, 9/11 and American Empire, wrote that, having always thought highly of Griffin, it was shocking to see him pushing a radical conspiracy theory about 9/11 on C-SPAN. What could have transformed this sober, reflective scholar into a conspiracy theorist? The truth, of course, was that I had been a conspiracy theorist all along, but I didn't become a conspiracy theorist in his eyes until I rejected the government's conspiracy theory in favor of the alternative. If these writers can't think in these terms, all the more could they not dare to think that the reason I changed from the one theory to the other was that I finally got empirical. I went from knowing virtually nothing about the relevant facts to knowing quite a few of those facts. Once we realize that both major theories about 9/11 are conspiracy theories, we can then see that we must evaluate them in the normal way. Ask which of the 2 theories stands up best in terms of the relevant facts. We must get empirical. The whole basis for the Bush administration's attack on Afghanistan and its more general war on terror has been the claim that the attacks of 9/11 were carried out by Arab Muslim members of al-Qaeda under the leadership of Osama bin Laden. This claim, however, was never proven. Shortly after 9/11, Secretary of State Colin Powell promised to provide a white paper showing that bin Laden was responsible, but this paper was never produced. The Taliban said that it would gladly hand over bin Laden if only the United States would provide evidence of his involvement of 9/11, but the Bush administration refused, leading a Taliban spokesman to say, "We have asked for proof of Osama's involvement, but they have refused. Why?" The 9/11 Commission, in spite of Kane and Hamilton's stated commitment to go to the facts, makes no mention of any of these facts. In claiming that they started with the facts, Kane and Hamilton say that their commission was not setting out to advocate one theory or interpretation of 9/11 versus another. And yet, they tell us, when we set up our staff teams, we told one team to tell the story of al-Qaeda's most successful operation, the 9/11 attacks. If that's not starting with a theory, what would be? The 9/11 movement, by contrast, has gotten empirical about this matter. With regard to the alleged hijackers, there was, according to the government, much evidence that implicates them, such as video frames of them at airports, passports found at crash sites, and Mohammed Atta's luggage filled with incriminating evidence that they say is luggage that was supposed to get on Flight 11. The 9/11 Truth Movement, however, has pointed out that none of this evidence can withstand scrutiny. It contains absurdities, such as when the first plane to strike the World Trade Center is said to have resulted in a passport jumping out of the plane and falling to the ground unsinged by the fireball that was created. Another passport and a red bandana, some people said the hijackers were wearing red bandanas, were found at the crash site of United 93, although none of the plane is visible at the site. According to the official theory, the plane was coming down 580 miles an hour at a steep angle and went into the soft soil of Pennsylvania so hard and so fast it went completely underground. And yet somehow there must have been an open window, the bandana and the passport jumped out. Moreover, the incriminating evidence in Muhammad Atta's alleged luggage contained his will. Now, if you were going to fly a plane into the World Trade Center, would you take your will? I'm unfortunately not making this stuff up. Moreover, the 9/11 Commission, in defending the official conspiracy theory, portrayed Atta and the others as devout Muslims, ready to meet their maker. But real truth seekers, getting empirical, have pointed out that Atta and several other of the alleged hijackers loved gambling, cocaine, alcohol, pork, and lap dances. These facts were even reported in the Wall Street Journal. And yet the 9/11 Commission, in spite of its professed love for facts, said it had no idea why these men often went to Las Vegas. Another stunning discovery occurred when one member of the 9/11 Truth movement decided to get empirical about an especially puzzling matter. The fact that the FBI's website on Osama bin Laden as a most wanted terrorist said nothing about 9/11. It mentioned other terrorist acts for which he was wanted, but nothing about 9/11. So Ed Haas, who writes the Muckraker Report, which you can read on the internet, contacted Rex Toome, the chief of investigative publicity for the FBI, and asked why not. Toome replied, "The reason why 9/11 is not mentioned on Osama bin Laden's most wanted page is because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. The 9/11 Commission could have made this discovery. Many months before the 9/11 Commission report appeared, the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Commission, comprised of relatives of the victims, asked the Commission to explain why bin Laden's profile on the FBI's Most Wanted Fugitives poster does not include the 9/11 attacks. However, the fact-loving 9/11 Commission, besides not answering this question, did not even reveal this fact to the American people. Another issue is why, assuming the truth of the story that the planes were hijacked, the U.S. military failed to intercept them before they could strike their targets. The official story is that it was the FAA's fault. For the first 3 years, the military claimed that although the FAA did notify it about all 4 flights, these notifications came too late. But the 9/11 Truth movement, getting empirical, showed that even if the FAA had been as slow as the military claimed, there still would have been time for the interceptions to be made. These things can happen very quickly. This empirical research supported the idea that there had been a stand-down order canceling standard procedures. However, in the summer of 2004, perhaps in response to these findings, the 9/11 Commission, in producing its report, came up with a radically new story, saying that the FAA, after notifying the military about the first flight only 9 minutes before it crashed into the North Tower, did not notify it about the other 3 flights at all until after they had already crashed. This new story was popularized by Michael Bronner in a Vanity Fair article called 9/11, the NORAD Tapes, to which I devote the first chapter of my book. The tapes in question were used by the 9/11 Commission to construct its new story. The military later gave these tapes to Bronner, who, as one of the producers of the film United 93, had proven that he would faithfully support the official line. The fact that Bronner was singled out by the military to receive these tapes means that his article can be considered a semi-official report. and Bronner surely did what the military had hoped, claiming that these tapes present the authentic military history of 9/11. But there are many reasons to doubt this claim. Let's take the claim that the FAA's air traffic controllers did not contact the military about the first flight, American Flight 11, until 8:38, only 9 minutes before it hit the tower. This would have been 24 minutes after the controller had seen the first sign of trouble, and 13 minutes after they knew that the plane appeared to be hijacked. There are many reasons to doubt this account. One of these involves discoveries I made while writing 9/11, debunking 9/11 debunking. Generally, I simply report other people's discoveries, but this time I did a little empirical work myself. This work involved extended email conversations with 2 air traffic controllers who have worked at FAA's Boston Center, which was in charge of Flight 11 when its troubles developed. Robin Horden, who worked there until 1981 and now lives in the Seattle area, and Colin Scoggins, who was and still is the military expert at Boston Center. Because of the information provided to me by these 2 men, we now have a much stronger evidence than we had before, which was pretty strong, that the official story about American Flight 11 is false. Although Scoggins did not himself say this, the information that he provided shows that his phone call to the military, to NEADS, must have occurred at about 8:29, not 8:38, as the official account claims. This would mean that the military had 18 minutes, not merely 9 minutes, to intercept Flight 11 before it got to Manhattan. Plenty of time, given the fact that such interceptions are usually made within 10 minutes. Horden's information shows, moreover, that the military must have been contacted even earlier, shortly after 8:20, when the transponder signal was lost and the plane went radically off course, as well as already having lost radio contact. This means that the military would have had over 25 minutes to make the interception. We have, therefore, very strong evidence that the military had been given a stand-down order, canceling standard procedures. This is only one of many examples in my book showing that if we get empirical, we can see that the tapes do not provide the authentic military history of 9/11. They have been doctored. Another claim made by the 9/11 Commission, then repeated by Bronner, is that there were only 2 bases in the northeast sector of the United States with fighter jets on alert: Otis Air National Guard Base in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and Langley Air Force Base in Langley, Virginia. Bronner, on the basis of this claim, says, referring to Colonel Robert Marr, the head of NEADS, incredibly, Marr has only 4 armed fighters at his disposal to defend about a quarter of the continental United States. Although this claim truly is incredible in the literal sense of the term, Bronner uses it, along with the 9/11 Commission, to explain why fighters were not immediately put over New York City to protect it, and why fighters to protect Washington, D.C. had to come all the way up from Langley. However, if Bronner and the Commission, while interviewing Scoggins, had asked him about this, he could have told them what he told me, that although it is technically correct that Otis and Langley are the only bases in that part of the United States that are designated as alert bases, this does not mean that they are the only bases from which NEADS could have drawn fighters. There were ready fighters in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Toledo, Ohio, Syracuse, New York, Burlington, Vermont, and Selfridge, Michigan, as well as Andrews Air Force Base right next to Washington, D.C., on which NEADS could have called Once again, if we get empirical about 9/11, the official story disintegrates. Popular Mechanics makes an even more outlandish claim about alert fighters, alleging that after the end of the Cold War, the United States did not keep any armed fighters on alert. They support this claim with a statement by former Republican Senator Warren Rudman, who was quoted in a Boston Globe article as saying, "We don't have capable fighter aircraft loaded with missiles sitting on runways in this country. We just don't do that anymore. To expect American fighter aircraft to intercept commercial airliners is totally unrealistic." This quotation comes at the conclusion of Popular Mechanics' section on interceptions, in which it argued that the military's failure to intercept the airlines does not mean that there had been a stand-down order. This quotation was evidently intended as the knockout punch. However, if one actually reads the Boston Globe article, one finds that it does not conclude with that quotation from Rudman. Instead, the writer follows it by saying, "Otis offers something close to that posture, however. Its 102nd Fighter Wing is equipped with 2 armed and fueled aircraft ready to fly around the clock each day of the year." So much for Popular Mechanics' knockout punch and its honesty. What was true at Otis, incidentally, was true of other alert bases around the country. For example, Captain Tom Pickle Herring, a pilot at Homestead Air Reserve Base near Miami, was quoted in 1999 as saying, "We have weapons on our jets. We need to be postured such that no one would dare threaten us. If needed, we could be killing things in 5 minutes or less." What he means is from scramble order to being up several thousand feet in the air, going after other planes, 5 minutes or less. As this and many other examples show, the subtitle of the Popular Mechanics book needs to be expanded to read, "How Conspiracy Theories Cannot Stand Up to the Facts If We Are Allowed to Determine What the Facts Are." Another question that can be answered responsibly only on the basis of an empirical investigation of the facts is why 3 buildings of the World Trade Center collapsed after 2 of them were struck by airplanes. Early reports claimed that the fires had melted the steel. A BBC television special 2 days after 9/11 quoted 2 experts as saying this. But some early members of the 9/11 truth movement, getting empirical, pointed out that although steel does not begin to melt until it reaches about 1,500 degrees Celsius, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, the maximum temperature that can be reached by diffuse fires based on hydrocarbons such as jet fuel, kerosene, would be about 1,000 degrees Celsius, 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Accordingly, even if the fires had been as hot as building fires can possibly be, they could not come within 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit of the temperature needed to melt steel. In response to this debunking by the 9/11 truth movement, Popular Mechanics has accused the 9/11 movement of creating a straw man, which it could easily knock down. It implies, in other words, that no defenders of the official theory had ever said that the buildings collapsed because their steel melted. But the falsity of this claim is illustrated by the BBC special. It has also been illustrated much more recently by Lee Hamilton, the vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, while he was being interviewed by Evan Solomon of the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. Hamilton, saying that the Commission rejected the view that the buildings were brought down by explosives, said, "What caused the collapse of the buildings was that the superheated jet fuel melted the steel superstructure of these buildings." Hamilton's astounding statement suggests that the 9/11 Commission, while endorsing the government's theory that the towers collapsed because of the impact of the airplanes and the resulting fires, did not even discuss such elementary facts as the melting point of steel and the maximum temperature of diffuse hydrocarbon fires. The definitive report on the destruction of the towers was supposed to be provided by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But its report, in spite of its thousands of pages, is far from definitive. Journalists have typically assumed that because the NIST report is based on the work of scientists, it is a scientific report. One of the main problems with the report, however, is that its conclusions are radically at variance with the work of its own scientists. For example, NIST suggests that the steel columns in the core of the towers buckled because they were heated up to 1,000 degrees Celsius, over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point they would have lost 90% of their strength. NIST's own scientists, however, reported that none of the recovered steel had reached temperatures over 250 degrees Celsius, 480 degrees Fahrenheit. And these were columns around the perimeter of the building where there would have been more oxygen. The 47 core columns would have not gotten even that hot because so little oxygen was available in the core of the buildings. So although NIST claims that the towers collapsed because their core columns reached 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,800 Fahrenheit, studies by its own scientists show that the core columns could not have been even 1/4 that hot. As this example shows, the NIST report on which popular mechanics and much of the press has relied is not a scientific report. It is a political document put out by an agency of the Bush administration. Equally unempirical is the treatment by NIST and popular mechanics of reports of explosions before and during the collapses. Both documents pretend that there were no explosions, even though the last time I checked Google for testimonies of explosions in the World Trade Center, I found that there were close to 300,000 items. One of those items is an essay I wrote entitled Explosive Testimony, which quotes 41 people, including firefighters, emergency medical workers, employees of the World Trade Center, and journalists, reporting that they witnessed what seemed to be explosions. For example, Wall Street reporter John Bussey. You all know the Wall Street Journal, that left-wing rag. Its reporter John Bussey said, "I looked up out of my office window to see what seemed like perfectly synchronized explosions coming from each floor, one after the other, from top to bottom. The floors blew to pieces." Another item on the internet is an essay by Canadian professor Graham McQueen, which shows that even if we restrict our focus to members of the New York Fire Department, we have 118 testimonies suggestive of explosions in the towers. NIST and popular mechanics, however, write as if these testimonies did not exist. Nothing better illustrates their wholly unempirical, unscientific approach. This unempirical approach is reflected, moreover, in journalistic accounts that rely on these official and semi-official reports. For example, Alexander Coburn, in assuring his readers that members of the 9/11 Truth Movement are nuts, said, "People inside who survived the collapse didn't hear a series of explosions." Coburn thereby revealed that he had not studied the evidence enough to be aware of one of the best-known testimonies by a person inside the towers, North Tower employee Teresa Valise. She said that while she was making her way downstairs, there were explosions going off everywhere. I was convinced that there were bombs planted all over the place, and someone was sitting at a control panel, pushing detonator buttons. There was another explosion, and another. I didn't know where to run. As Coburn's embarrassing essay demonstrates, journalists cannot safely rely on reports written to support the official conspiracy theory. They need to get empirical about 9/11. NIST and Popular Mechanics, besides dealing with testimony about explosions in an unempirical manner, do the same with regard to reports that molten metal was found under the rubble. The scientists at NIST, unlike Lee Hamilton, knew the fire could not have melted any steel. So their preferred method of dealing with this problem was to ignore or even deny the reports. John Gross, one of the chief authors of the NIST report, was captured on film while he was making a public presentation, saying that he knew of absolutely no eyewitness who has said there was a pool of molten steel. Popular Mechanics cites a professor's claim that the photographs said to show melted steel really show materials that appear to be other than steel, such as glass with unmelted steel rods in it. Popular Mechanics then quotes triumphantly this professor's observation that glass melts at a much lower temperature than steel. However, the evidence for molten steel under the rubble was neither non-existent nor based merely on photographs. There were many eyewitnesses, including Peter Tully, president of Peter Tully Construction Company, which was involved in the cleanup. He said that he saw pools of literally molten steel at the site. The same was reported by Mark Loiseau, the head of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, and also by Fire Captain Philip Rivolo, who said, "You'd get down below and you would see molten steel, running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava." Although these and many other eyewitness testimonies exist, NIST writes as if they did not. Nevertheless, surely knowing that they do, NIST has suggested in a document put out in 2006 entitled Answers to Frequently Asked Questions that even if there was some molten steel in the rubble pile, it was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile than to explosions. Popular Mechanics expanded on this incredible explanation, saying, "The debris pile sat cooking for weeks with the materials at the bottom of the pile getting increasingly hot because the fires were confined and lost minimal heat to the atmosphere. As a result, the fires could have easily reached temperatures sufficient to melt steel." This is amazing. If you remember high school physics and chemistry, hydrocarbon fires require oxygen. According to NIST and Popular Mechanics, however, the fact that the fires were not exposed to the atmosphere did not extinguish the fires, it allowed them to get hotter. Indeed, over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. This is what passes for science at NIST and Popular Mechanics these days. According to the official conspiracy theory, the Pentagon was struck by American Airlines Flight 77 under the control of Hani Hanjour. I'm now asking the question, what caused the damage to Wedge 1 of the Pentagon? However, Hani Hanjour was known to be a terrible pilot, so bad that he could not safely fly a single-engine airplane. Instructors would not go up with him a second time, saying, "You're too dangerous." And yet, in order to hit Wedge 1, according to the official story, he had to perform an amazing feat in his hijacked airliner, bring it down 8,000 feet in a 330-degree downward spiral in under 4 minutes, then bring it in at ground level without even scraping the lawn. Getting empirical about this claim would simply mean asking some experienced airline pilots if this was possible. Russ Wittenberg, one of the many pilots who belong to the 9/11 Truth movement, says that he, in spite of his 35 years of experience flying commercial airliners, could not have done it. For an amateur who couldn't even fly a Cessna to maneuver the jetliner in such a highly professional manner, Wittenberg adds, would have been totally impossible. Ralph Omholt, a former 757 pilot, agrees, saying, "The idea that an unskilled pilot could have flown this trajectory is simply too ridiculous to consider." How did Popular Mechanics deal with this problem? It ignored it. Although its authors like to tell us how many experts they consulted, they do not report asking any airline pilots if Honjour could have flown this trajectory. Indeed, they do not even mention this trajectory. They refer to this part of the alleged flight of American 77 only in passing. That is, after arguing that although Honjour had never flown an airliner and was a terrible pilot, he was able to get this plane back to Washington by simply putting it on autopilot. And then they add, he steered the plane manually for only the final 8 minutes of the flight, for only the final 8 minutes when the impossible was done. Popular Mechanics claims that it has shown all the key claims of the 9/11 truth movement to be mistaken. One of the movement's central claims, however, is that whatever damaged the Pentagon, it could not have been Flight 77 under the control of Hani Hanjour. Popular Mechanics does not even try to refute this claim, perhaps hoping that most of its readers will not notice. There has been much controversy within the 9/11 movement itself as to exactly what happened at the Pentagon. But on this point, there is absolute unanimity. Even those who believe that it was a Boeing 757 may even believe that it was Flight 77, say, but of course, it couldn't have been under the control of Hani Hanjour. So we've got absolute unanimity on that point. And on my next one. The Popular Mechanics book also fails to deal with another claim on which there is unanimity, that if al-Qaeda terrorists had hijacked an airliner in order to crash it into the Pentagon, they would have not chosen to hit Wedge 1. This claim is based on several empirical facts about this section of the Pentagon. For one thing, Wedge 1 was the only section that had been renovated to make it less vulnerable to terrorist attacks. Also, because the renovation was not yet complete, it was only sparsely populated. A strike on any other part of the Pentagon, therefore, would have caused far more damage and far more death. Moreover, terrorists who hated America would presumably have wanted to kill some of the Pentagon's top brass and the Secretary of Defense. And yet these people were safely on the opposite side of the Pentagon, as far from Wedge 1 as possible. All these facts, moreover, were well known. If these terrorists were brilliant enough to outfox the world's most sophisticated defense system, they would not have gone out of their way to hit Wedge 1 when they could have simply crashed into the roof above the offices of Donald Rumsfeld and the senior officers. Here is what Popular Mechanics says about this problem. That was it. Popular Mechanics has definitely not defended the idea that the Pentagon was struck by American Flight 77 under the control of Hani Hanjour. Another problem with the official conspiracy theory involves the crash of United Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. At first, the official story was that it crashed because the heroic passengers brought it down. The story was later changed to say that the hijackers brought it down because they feared that the heroic passengers were going to overcome them and gain control of the plane. And so they brought it down at 580 miles per hour. From the first, however, there was considerable evidence that the flight was actually shot down by a U.S. military jet. This evidence is of many types. Witnesses reported seeing debris falling from the plane. Debris was spread over an 8-mile area. One engine or part of it was found far from the crash site, suggesting that it was hit by a heat-seeking missile. There was no plane at the crash site, leaving officials with no option but to claim that the plane had buried itself completely underground, except, of course, for the bandana and the passport. Several residents in the area reported seeing a small white jet plane prior to the crash and hearing sounds suggesting a shoot-down by a missile. One resident said she received a call from a friend who reported shortly after the crash that her husband, who was in the Air Force, had called and said, "I can't talk, but we just shot down a plane." One of the Otis pilots reported being told after he returned to base that an airliner had been shot down in Pennsylvania by a military F-16. Popular Mechanics deals with a few of the items in this list by distorting the evidence and with the rest by simply ignoring them. You can read all of this in my book. Here I will focus only on the most important element in its attempted refutation of the claim that United 93 was shot down. This is the claim that made by the 9/11 Commission that the military could not possibly have shot the plane down because it didn't even know the plane had been hijacked until after it had crashed. Here is Popular Mechanics' statement as to whether a fighter could have shot down the plane. The 9/11 Commission report is clear that no shoot-down order was in place for Flight 93 due to garbled communication between the various agencies. When the flight crashed, NORAD was still unaware the plane had been hijacked. It is true that the 9/11 Commission makes this claim, but is this claim supported by the available facts? The editors of Popular Mechanics, in their introduction, said that they were going to confront the claims of the 9/11 Truth Movement with the facts. But what they do here is simply confront the claim of the 9/11 Truth Movement with the claim made by the 9/11 Commission that the military did not learn about the hijacking of Flight 93 until 10:07, several minutes after it had crashed. In citing this claim as authoritative, it simply ignores the empirical fact that many of the participants made statements that contradicted the Commission's claim. Here are some examples. General Larry Arnold was the commanding general of NORAD within the continental United States. When asked by the 9/11 Commission what NORAD was doing at 9/24, Arnold said, "Our focus was on Flight 93, which was being pointed out to us very aggressively by the FAA. 9/24 was 40 minutes earlier than the 9/11 Commission later claims the FAA told the military about this flight." During an interview with Peter Jennings on ABC in 2002, Brigadier General Montague Winfield, who was the Deputy Director of Operations at the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, said, "We received the report from the FAA that Flight 93 had turned off its transponder and was heading towards Washington, D.C. Other military officers have testified that, besides knowing about United 93, the military was tracking it. 2 days after 9/11, General Myers himself said that fighters were scrambled on the airliner that eventually crashed in Pennsylvania. We had gotten somebody close to it. 2 days after 9/11, Paul Wolfowitz, who was then Deputy Secretary of Defense, said that the Air Force was tracking the hijacked plane that crashed in Pennsylvania and had been in position to bring it down if necessary. In 2002, Colonel Robert Marr, the head of NEADS, told Peter Jennings that having received shoot-down authorization from Richard Clark, he passed that on to the pilots, adding, "United Airlines Flight 93 will not be allowed to reach Washington, D.C." 2 pilots, moreover, have independently said that they received those orders and would have shot down Flight 93 if it had not crashed on its own. Like Wolfowitz, these pilots deny that the flight was actually shot down. But the question at issue is the 9/11 Commission's claim that the military did not even know that this flight had been hijacked. And their testimony, like that of Arnold, Clark, Marr, Myers, Wolfowitz, and Winfield, directly contradicts that claim. We have extremely strong evidence, therefore, that insofar as the NORAD tapes given to the 9/11 Commission and Michael Bronner say otherwise, they have been doctored. They do not provide the authentic military history of 9/11 or anything close to it. In this lecture, I've given several examples of what you can learn about 9/11 if you get empirical, checking the actual facts rather than simply, like popular mechanics and far too many journalists, equating the facts with the claims made by people defending the official conspiracy theory. But if reporters and news organizations would develop the courage to get empirical about 9/11, the official theory will completely unravel. Evidence for this claim is provided by former senior CI analyst Bill Christensen, who said in a letter to friends in August of 2006, "I spent the first 4.5 years since September 11th utterly unwilling to consider seriously the conspiracy theories surrounding the attacks of that day. In the last half year, and after considerable agony, I've changed my mind." In an essay entitled "Stop Belittling the Theories About September 11th," Christensen summarized what he considered the persuasive evidence that the events of September 11th did not unfold as the Bush administration and the 9/11 Commission would have us believe. This conclusion is of overwhelming importance, Christensen argues, because the fraud of 9/11 involves a much greater crime against the American people and people of the world than any other charges of fraud connected with the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. Why? It is more important because the events of 9/11 have been used by the administration to justify every single aspect of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East since September 11th. It is Christensen continues, it is more important also because it affects the very core of our entire political system. It is a conspiracy so far successful not only against the people of the United States, but against the entire world. Christensen's analysis makes clear why getting the truth about 9/11 publicly revealed is so important. Getting it revealed, however, will be very difficult. One reason was pointed out by former CIA case officer Robert Baer. He's the man upon whom the movie Syriana was based, the George Clooney character. And he is the one that was assigned to write the review of the new Pearl Harbor for The Nation several years ago, at which time he ridiculed me for being a conspiracy theorist. But during this recent interview with Tom Hartman of Portland, he indicated that he had changed his mind. Now he believed 9/11 was an inside job. But explaining why this getting the truth out will be difficult, Baer went on to say, a lot of people in the United States have profited from 9/11. Great fortunes are being made. This is a problem for getting the truth about 9/11 revealed, because those who are making great fortunes include corporations who wield great influence over what can be reported in the mainstream media. Nevertheless, I believe there is still hope that the truth may come out. Other countries, such as Canada and several European countries, may begin exposing the lies so loudly that the American press will not be able to pretend not to hear. The activist side of the 9/11 truth movement in the United States and other countries may begin organizing mass rallies to demand that the truth finally be told. The Democrats, now in control of Congress, may develop the courage to hold hearings about 9/11. If so, the press will have little choice but to report on them. At some point, the press will realize that to save its own reputation, it will need to get out front on this story so that it can take credit for revealing it. The 9/11 truth movement is now far stronger than it was only a year ago, thanks to the addition over this past year of many more scientists, architects, engineers, pilots, and former members of the military and intelligence services. It is now much more obvious that the 9/11 movement is based on professional, informed evaluations of the empirical evidence, and that it is the official story that fits what most people mean when they say that they reject conspiracy theories, theories that, being based on groundless speculation, are wildly at odds with the evidence, except evidence that has been planted. But perhaps the greatest boon to the 9/11 truth movement is the fact that in 2006, defenders of the official theory changed their strategy. Rather than continuing simply to ridicule or completely ignore the claims of the 9/11 truth movement, they decided to try to debunk our claims. These attempts backfired because they served only to make clear how completely at variance with the empirical evidence the official theory is. They made clear that the official story cannot be defended. By demonstrating this, my latest book is evidently more convincing than my previous ones. In a statement on Amazon.com, international lawyer John Whitbeck says, "After reading David Ray Griffin's previous books on the subject, I was over 90% convinced that 9/11 was an inside job. Now, after reading Debunking 9/11 Debunking, I am, I regret to say, 100% convinced." I hope this book will help the worldwide 9/11 truth movement finally get the truth out about 9/11 and get the big lie exposed. Thank you very much for your kind attention.